Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so you sent us this really interesting pile of material on Jordan Peterson, specifically his ideas about order and chaos.
Hmm.
And our job today, our mission, is to pull out the key stuff for you. We know you want to get up to speed quickly, but, properly understand it, see the different angles.
Get those aha moments.
Exactly, without feeling totally bogged down. So we're going to unpack this very popular framework he uses. We'll look at the psych roots, the myths he pulls from, why it's so persuasive, maybe.
And also where it might fall short, for actual psychological growth, intellectual depth.
Right, because at the core, it really seems to boil down to this pair, order and chaos.
That's the foundation. And we'll be looking at it, as you said, through a critical psychoanalytic lens,
Oh,
trying to understand not just what he's saying, but how it works, why it connects with people.
okay.
And yeah, where maybe it oversimplifies things.
Let's jump in then. This big idea, order and chaos. How does Peterson actually define them? Let's start with order.
Okay, order. For Peterson, it's essentially explored territory.
Yeah.
It's the known, the predictable.
Right.
He uses phrases like the great father culture, which he describes as both protective and tyrannical. It's about stability, structure, even just like your plan for the next day.
So it's comfort zones, routines.
Pretty much. It's, as he puts it, when you get what you expect to get. It feels safe, known. But the potential downside, maybe, is seeing anything outside that as purely negative.
Okay, makes sense. That's order. So then chaos, the other side of the coin.
Chaos is the unexplored territory.
Right.
This is where things get unpredictable. He links it to the great mother, nature, which is both creative and destructive.
So not entirely bad then.
Well, he acknowledges that duality. It's where something unexpected happens, like when you get fired. It's the threatening stranger, but also, interestingly, your scary, audacious goal.
Ah, okay. So potential, possibility.
Exactly. Realm of possibility, inherent uncertainty.
Yeah.
But, despite acknowledging the creative side, often the emphasis does seem to fall on the threatening aspects of chaos.
So order is known, chaos is unknown. And he sees these as like fundamental forces.
Absolutely fundamental. He literally calls them the two fundamental elements of reality itself.
Yeah.
He compares them to the yang and yin and the Taoist symbol.
Right.
And in Maps of Meaning, he basically says culture, which is order, is our defense mechanism against chaos breaking back in. They're always interacting.
And this interaction point, this line between them, that's where he puts meaning, right? Which seems super important to him.
Crucial. Yeah. Meaning for Peterson isn't some, abstract thing you ponder. It's found right there on line between order and chaos.
How does he phrase that?
In 12 Rules, he says, to straddle that fundamental duality is to be balanced. He talks about it being a path or the way.
Like a religious path.
It definitely has that flavor. Meaning is the ultimate balance. Meaning is the way, the path of life more abundant, the straight and narrow path. What's really interesting psychoanalytically is how the specific balance gets elevated to this high, moral, almost spiritual plane.
Yeah.
It potentially pushes other ways of finding meaning, maybe quieter ways or different kinds of balance, to the margins.
And he really amps up the stakes, doesn't he? Like, fall off that path and its meaninglessness, which sounds terrifying the way he describes it.
Totally. He says in Maps of Meaning, life without law remains chaotic. Life that is pure law becomes sterile. Too much order is deadening. Too much chaos is destructive.
So the balance is everything.
And the search for that balance, that meaning, he frames it as a defense against suffering. His whole system is presented as an antidote to chaos. That existential urgency is a big part of the appeal, I think.
It makes sense. Now, something else that jumps out is the language he uses. Very primal imagery. Dragons, mothers, monsters under the bed.
Oh, definitely. It's steeped in that kind of archetypal, almost fairy tale language.
Yeah.
Let's take the dragon.
The dragon of chaos. He calls it a symbol for the source of fear itself. I remember hearing him ask, why would a dragon hoard gold?
Right. His answer being,
Because a dragon represents everything that you're afraid of, and the gold is the reward for facing it.
exactly. It boils down complex adult fears, anxiety, the unknown potential failure into this single mythical beast guarding a treasure. It's a powerful simplification.
And then the parental figures, mothers and fathers.
Yes. Chaos gets linked to the great mother, nature, creative, but also destructive, and sometimes rather pointedly to things like the hidden anger of your mother.
Oof.
Yeah. While order is the great father, culture, structure, but also potentially tyrannical, he paints a particularly harsh picture of the destructive great mother in Maps of Meaning.
And he uses this parenting frame for advice too, right? Like making kids socially desirable or choosing between safety and strength.
He does. Tapping into those really early experiences of dependency, authority, safety, it gives the ideas immediate emotional weight. But again, you have to ask if complex societal issues or adult relationships are being reduced too much to these kind of nursery dynamics.
Right. And that leads to the monsters, the paradise of childhood stuff. Chaos is the monster under the bed. Growing up means leaving the unconscious paradise of childhood. He talks about the abyss, the ultimate dragon. It feels very foundational.
It offers comfort, I think. Reframing adult anxieties in these familiar story structures where, maybe the lines between good and evil seem clearer. But the risk is that it keeps things a bit infantilized. It might prevent developing more complex adult ways of dealing with ambiguity and fear.
Okay, so we've got the definitions, the evocative language.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier, it feels like how he uses order and chaos isn't always the same. It seems to shift a bit.
That's a really key observation. There's a definite elasticity to how he employs these terms.
Sometimes it sounds like they're just real, objective forces out there. Like in Beyond Order, the two fundamental elements of reality itself. Sounds pretty concrete.
Mm-hmm. And that gives the framework a lot of weight, doesn't it? Like
Yeah.
he's describing the bedrock of existence.
But then other times, it's much more psychological. Chaos is stress, emotions, the unpredictable. Order is no stress, thinking, the predictable. It feels like it's about our inner state, our experience.
Exactly. The focus shifts from the world out there to our perception in here.
And then it slides again into being a moral command. That path between them becomes the divine way. You hear things like, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient, or the idea that we have a responsibility to transform the chaos of potential into the realities of habitable order. Suddenly, it's not just description, it's prescription. It's telling you what you must do.
And that flexibility, that sliding between the ontological, the psychological, and the moral, that's where a lot of the rhetorical power comes from. It makes the concepts feel universally applicable, deeply important.
But maybe less precise.
Well, yes. It can also make it harder to pin down rigorous philosophical grounding, especially for the moral claims. The terms stretch to cover a lot of ground.
Okay, so a slightly shifting foundation. Now let's dig into the Jungian stuff, because Jung seems absolutely central to his whole system.
Oh, absolutely. Carl Jung's ideas, especially archetypes, are woven throughout Peterson's work.
Let's revisit the Great Mother archetype. You mentioned he has a specific take.
He really emphasizes the negative pole, the destructive, engulfing, terrifying aspect linked to nature and the unknown. That quote we mentioned from Maps of Meaning is a prime example. It's a very bleak portrayal compared to Jung's more ambivalent view.
Okay, and then the hero. That's a big one for him.
Huge. The hero is the individual who confronts chaos, faces the dragon, and creates order. Peterson explicitly links pursuit of individual interest with being the hero. The hero's journey, in his interpretation, is this external quest into the unknown.
To fight the dragon of chaos.
Which is the symbol of fear, the unknown, but also, crucially, guarding the treasure. He describes it vividly, often emphasizing its predatory nature, like that cat-snake-bird description from one lecture.
Right, I remember that.
The core message is, face the terrifying thing,
Yeah.
and you'll find something valuable.
Confront your fears, get the reward. Okay. And the shadow, our dark side.
For Peterson, the shadow is primarily about our capacity for malevolence, for doing harm. His advice to grow teeth is about acknowledging that potential so you can consciously choose not to act it out. It's about integrating your inner monster, so to speak.
Now, this brings us to a really controversial part. The gendering. Masculine order, feminine chaos.
Yes, this is a major point of contention and analysis.
He's pretty direct about it. Quotes like, order is the white masculine serpent, chaos, its black feminine counterpart, or saying order is associated with masculinity, chaos with the feminine. He seems to see it as fixed.
He does. He's even stated, I think, in that GQ interview, that this association is immutable, maybe biologically rooted. This is a significant departure from how many Jungians understand archetypes, which are generally seen as symbolic potentials within everyone, regardless of gender.
Right.
Attaching them so rigidly to biological sex is seen by critics as essentializing gender roles in a problematic way.
And it sets up this dynamic, doesn't it? Like, masculine order has to sort of manage or confront feminine chaos.
That often seems to be the underlying narrative, yes. Even when talking about balance, the story frequently becomes one of masculine structure needing to impose itself on or wrestle with a fundamentally feminine, chaotic force. Critics argue this reinforces traditional, often hierarchical gender relations.
So it seems like a pattern emerges, taking these complex Jungian ideas and, well, simplifying them, creating shortcuts.
That's a fair assessment from a critical perspective.
Hmm.
Let's take the Great Mother again. Jung emphasizes ambivalence. The terrible mother and the good mother are aspects of the same archetype. Peterson focuses heavily on the terrible, destructive side.
Why do that?
Well, psychologically, it might provide comfort by externalizing dependency anxieties onto this scary Mother Nature figure. And from a, let's say, market perspective, a clear, emotionally charged, slightly terrifying image grabs attention more than nuance.
Makes sense. And the hero.
Peterson emphasizes the external fight, the responsibility to confront external chaos. Jung's concept of individuation, while involving confronting the unconscious, which can feel chaotic, is a much more internal process involving the shadow, the animus. Peterson's version is more like a straightforward action movie plot.
Easier to grasp.
Definitely. More aligned with popular self-help narratives.
The dragon of chaos, too, becomes mostly just
Yeah.
bad, the thing to be slain.
Largely, yes. The symbol of fear, the unknown obstacle. In mythology and Jung, dragons can be much more symbols of primordial power, wisdom, even the Ouroboros representing wholeness before differentiation. Peterson's dragon is more of a clear antagonist guarding treasure. Again, simpler, provides a concrete target.
And the shadow?
Peterson frames it mainly as the capacity for malevolence, something to be controlled. Be a monster, then learn to control it. Jung saw the shadow as all repressed aspects of the psyche, positive and negative, needing integration, not just control.
So control versus integration.
Peterson's version offers a sense of mastery over the inner monster, which is appealing. But Jung's is about lifelong, complex integration. There's a consistent move from internal complexity to externalized myth.
You can see why that would be appealing, making internal struggles seem like external battles you can win. But what gets lost?
The risk is psychological bypassing. You focus on slaying the external dragon instead of doing the often messier, less heroic feeling work of understanding your own internal conflicts, your own shadow.
Great, so Jung is one pillar. The other huge one is the Bible. He uses biblical stories all the time.
Constantly. It's a major source for illustrating the order-chaos dynamic.
Genesis, Cain and Abel, Noah, Moses, Christ. He weaves them all into this framework, like seeing the Genesis creation story as God the Father using logos, the word, to create order out of primordial chaos.
Which is, again, one way to read it. But biblical scholars point to complexities he often glosses over.
Such as?
Well, there are multiple creation accounts in Genesis itself. There are debates about whether it's creation ex nihilo, from nothing, or shaping existing chaos, the interpretation of the Hebrew word tehom, how it relates to other ancient Near Eastern myths, like the Babylonian Enuma Elish. Some scholars argue Genesis is actually a polemic against those myths, not just repeating them.
So focusing only on order from chaos misses a lot of that context.
It provides a clear, resonant framework, easily digestible as timeless wisdom, but it can flatten the specific historical, cultural, and theological nuances of the text.
And how does he approach these stories generally? Is he saying they're literal history, allegory?
His approach is mostly what you might call pragmatic myth. He often explicitly says he's not primarily interested in whether the stories are literally historically true. He's more interested in what he sees as their deep psychological or practical truth, what lessons they offer for living. He talks about approaching them as a mystery, but the goal seems to be extracting principles for navigating life, for acting in the world. It's very focused on what does this story mean for you on your journey?
So it's useful if it helps you live better.
That seems to be the main criterion.
Yeah.
Which of course allows him to sidestep tricky scholarly questions about historical accuracy or authorial intent. But it also makes the interpretations somewhat unfalsifiable. They're true if they feel useful within his framework.
And this leads to distilling them into life lessons, right? Like the 12 rules for life.
Exactly. He's very much in a didactic mode, looking for actionable takeaways. Even when he acknowledges the profound mystery of, say, the Garden of Eden story, he tends to resolve it into lessons about consciousness, choice, suffering, and the need to create order.
Clear guidance versus maybe losing the ambiguity.
That's the trade-off. You get clear rules, a map for navigating life's chaos. But you might lose a richer, more complex, perhaps more unsettling understanding of the source texts themselves, with all their contradictions and deep ambiguities. Okay, we're getting a picture of the framework and his methods. Now, what about the pushback? What are the main criticisms? There's quite a range. You have Jungian analysts and scholars raising concerns about oversimplification, misinterpretation, sometimes seeing a political agenda warping the psychology, or even a kind of pathological identification with the hero archetype.
And the gendering we talked about.
Yes, the rigid gendering of archetypes is a major critique from Jungian and feminist perspectives. Then you have theologians and biblical academics pointing out anachronistic readings, missing the original context or polemical thrust of the texts, flattening complex narratives. Some see his use of Jung as almost Gnostic, detached from traditional interpretations.
What about philosophers or psychoanalysts?
Psychoanalysts sometimes draw parallels to earlier thinkers, critiqued for similar tendencies. Philosophers like Paul Feyerabend have critiqued what they see as flimsy philosophical arguments, particularly around postmodernism and Marxism. And then public intellectuals and journalists have sometimes focused on perceived pseudo-profundity, vagueness, or even banality hidden in complex language.
That's a lot of different angles. Are there common threads?
Several key themes emerge. One is definitely cherry-picking and misinterpretation sources, taking bits of Jung or the Bible that fit the order-chaos model and ignoring conflicting or complicating details.
Like ignoring Jung's emphasis on integrating opposites, not just battling them.
Exactly. Or reading Genesis through a very Christian lens without acknowledging its original context or how it might be critiquing other myths. Another major one is gender essentialism, that rigid linking of masculine order, feminine chaos, and its implications.
We covered that. What else?
Pseudo-profundity and verbosity. Comes up the idea that simple self-help concepts are sometimes dressed up in unnecessarily complex or vague academic-sounding language. And, relatedly, the instrumentalization of myth and psychology.
Meaning using them to back up pre-existing ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Critics suggest the framework is sometimes used to justify particular social or political views rather than emerging organically from the source material. It's like constructing a narrative to fit a desired conclusion.
Okay. So let's step back and think about the appeal. If there are these criticisms about simplification, why is it so popular? What's the psychological pull? You use the term blanket for it.
Yes. From a psychoanalytic perspective, the framework's appeal might lie in how it resonates with certain basic psychological defenses. The clear binary of order-chaos, good, bad, known maps, quite neatly onto the defense mechanism of splitting.
Splitting, like black and white thinking.
Exactly. It's common in early development, seeing things as either all good or all bad, because integrating complexity and ambivalence is difficult. Peterson's framework offers that clarity, that simple categorization, which can feel comforting when the world feels overwhelming or ambiguous.
What other defenses might be relevant?
Regression, perhaps. The heavy use of parental figures, childhood myths, monsters. It can feel like a retreat to an earlier, simpler way of understanding the world, which can be soothing in times of stress.
Like going back to fairy tales for answers.
In a way, also projection. By framing chaos, fear, and negativity as external forces, the dragon, the terrible mother, it allows internal anxieties and bad feelings to be projected outward. It's easier to fight an external dragon than wrestle with your own internal chaos.
Makes it someone else's fault or something else's fault.
It can function that way.
Yeah.
And maybe even a touch of magical thinking. The idea that following these specific rules, imposing this specific kind of order, will automatically lead to meaning and protect you from suffering. It offers an illusion of control.
How does this connect to developmental theories, like Melanie Klein?
Klein talked about the paranoid schizoid position, characterized by splitting, projection, and fear of annihilation, which resonates with the stark order versus chaos battle. Maturity involves moving towards the depressive position, where you can integrate good and bad in yourself and others, tolerate ambiguity, feel guilt and concern. Peterson's framework arguably keeps people more in that earlier, simpler, paranoid schizoid way of relating to the world.
And object relations theory.
That looks at how early relationships shape our internal world. A persistent, strong need for external order, or a constant framing of life as a battle, might reflect internalizations of early relational patterns where things felt chaotic or unsafe, leading to a reliance on rigid external structures or defenses.
So the language itself, the monster under the bed, the dragon, the paradise of childhood, it reinforces this.
The prevalence of this infantilizing language, applied to adult problems, arguably encourages a less mature mode of coping. There's less emphasis in his work on language that embraces complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, the hallmarks of adult reality.
So the blanket fort provides comfort, but the cost is staying in the fort, not developing adult ambiguity tolerance.
That's the core psychoanalytic critique, yes. It potentially hinders psychological maturation by offering simplified solutions and externalized battles, preventing the harder work of integrating internal conflict and tolerating life's inherent messiness.
Okay, let's look at the impact. He clearly connects with a huge audience. What do people say they get from him?
Looking at positive reception, recurring themes are definitely finding meaning and purpose. That antidote to chaos idea really lands. Personal responsibility is huge. The call to self-improvement, clean your room.
Right, the memes.
Exactly. Clarity in a confusing world. And for some, particularly men, a validation of masculinity or traditional values they feel are under attack. Online, you see the clean your room meme, the be a monster quotes, the lobster analogy, the yin-yang order chaos visuals. These simple, sticky ideas spread easily.
Can we separate the purely comforting aspects from the genuinely actionable insights?
I think so. The comfort comes from the validation. Your struggles are real and cosmic. The simplification, here's a clear map. The sense of belonging, others feel this way too. Maybe the externalization. It's chaos, not just you.
And the actionable.
Things like taking personal responsibility, clean your room, set your house in order, telling the truth, don't lie, focusing on incremental improvement, and confronting fear, slay the dragon. These are concrete actions people can take.
But is there a risk of this becoming a kind of psychological retreat, focusing only on personal order?
That's a concern raised by critics. If the primary focus becomes tidying your own psychic room, does it lead to ignoring larger systemic issues? Does the memification oversimplify complex problems?
The clean your room idea, can it shut down critique?
Potentially. By constantly redirecting focus to individual shortcomings. Is your house in perfect order before you criticize the world? It can function to sideline discussions about social injustice, economic inequality, or political reform. It can promote a kind of quietism.
So critics see this comfort and simplicity as the main draw, but argue it comes at a cost.
Yes, that's a common thread. Robinson talking about vagueness and banality, Fagard about flimsy philosophy, the Jungian critiques about loss of depth, even ex-followers who find the framework ultimately too rigid or insufficient for life's complexities. It fits neatly into the meaning crisis narrative in the broader self-help marketplace, offering accessible, empowering, somewhat anti-establishment feeling answers. A comfort commodity.
Okay, to really sharpen this, let's contrast Peterson's approach with how other thinkers handle chaos and maturity. How would, say, an essentialist like Sartre or Camus deal with this?
Existentialists fundamentally start with chaos, absurdity, meaninglessness. There's no pre-given order to cling to or return to. Maturity for them involves confronting this anxiety head-on, embracing radical freedom, Sartre, finding meaning in the revolt against absurdity, Camus, accepting the ambiguity, Beauvoir, and taking responsibility for creating your own values and meaning authentically.
So if someone lost their job, Peterson might say, confront the chaos, reestablish order, be the hero. What would an existentialist say?
They might say, okay, this structure is gone. You are now radically free. This is terrifying, yes, but also an opportunity to reevaluate what truly matters to you, to choose your next project, to define yourself anew, facing the void. You lose the comfort of Peterson's path, but gain a potentially deeper, more authentic self-creation.
What about contrasting him with psychoanalysts he draws on, like Jung or others like Winnicott or Klein?
While Jung talked about balancing opposites, the goal was internal integration, individuation, not necessarily conquering external chaos. Winnicott emphasized the facilitating environment needed for a true self to emerge, and maturity involving the capacity for concern and tolerating ambivalence. Klein, as we discussed, saw maturity as moving from splitting towards integrating good and bad, the depressive position.
So dealing with grief, for instance, Peterson might focus on finding meaning in the suffering, bearing the burden, reestablishing order. Psychoanalysis
Would likely focus on the internal work of mourning, processing the loss, allowing the painful feelings, integrating the relationship with the lost person into oneself, tolerating the ambivalence and sadness without needing immediate order or meaning imposed. Again, less immediate structure perhaps, but potentially deeper emotional processing and integration.
And one more angle, process philosophers, Whitehead or Deleuze. They sound like they'd embrace chaos.
Very much so. Process philosophy sees reality itself as fundamentally flux, becoming, interconnectedness, Whitehead, or multiplicity and constant change, Deleuze's Rhizome. Chaos isn't something to be ordered, it's more like the inherent creativity and unpredictability of existence. Maturity isn't about finding a fixed point between order and chaos, but about embracing the flow, being flexible, affirming creativity, moving beyond rigid binaries.
How would that apply to something like systemic injustice?
Peterson might focus on individual responsibility within the flawed system. A process thinker might look for ways to disrupt the system itself, create new connections, new ways of being, deterritorialization, new assemblages, and to lose the terms. It's a much more dynamic list binary view.
So stepping outside the blanket fort, refusing that immediate comfort, what's lost and what's gained.
You lose the immediate comfort, the illusion of a pre-charted map, the security that comes from externalizing your struggles onto chaos or dragons.
Yeah.
You gain increased tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, which is crucial for navigating complex reality. You potentially gain deeper self-knowledge, more authentic ways of making meaning, richer and more whole relationships, tolerating flaws in self and others, a greater capacity for understanding and engaging with systemic issues, and ultimately a more flexible and resilient self.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this. Where does the order-chaos binary ultimately fail or fall short?
Well, critics argue it oversimplifies fundamental concepts, leading to difficulty adapting when reality isn't so black and white. It reduces psychological complexity, potentially leading to lopsided development if you only focus on order or heroism. It flattens rich myths and scriptures into simplistic lessons. And the gender essentialism is deeply problematic, potentially justifying inequality.
And how does this mythic blanket fort limit growth psychologically, intellectually, even politically?
It can stunt ambiguity tolerance, making people rigid or anxious in complex situations. It might promote psychological regression, relying on simple answers instead of mature coping. By externalizing conflict, it can prevent necessary internal work and lead to projecting issues onto others. And by focusing so heavily on individual order, it can discourage systemic critique and meaningful political engagement, leading to apathy or even victim blaming.
What are the concrete risks of relying too heavily on this framework?
Potentially, stunted resilience, a kind of brittleness when faced with situations that don't fit the binary, disengagement from complex social realities, maybe a kind of endless adolescence, always seeking external validation or structure, struggling with the responsibilities of nuanced adult life, and being susceptible to market-driven thought leadership that prioritizes viral simplicity over rigor.
And the alternative, the fruits of engaging with the messy, complex adult world without the fort?
Enhance resilience and adaptability, precisely because you're used to navigating unpredictability. Deeper, more authentic relationships built on empathy and acceptance of imperfection. The potential for more meaningful social and political engagement. Tackling root causes, and ultimately, more profound personal growth and individuation, becoming a more integrated, authentic self.
So wrapping this up, Peterson's framework clearly offers something compelling, a structure, a call to responsibility, a path to meaning in what can feel like a chaotic world.
Absolutely. Its appeal is undeniable, especially when people feel lost or overwhelmed.
But as we've explored, that appeal seems heavily reliant on simplification, on creating these clear binaries, these externalized battles, these comforting, almost childlike narratives.
And while that offers solace, the potential cost is a reduced capacity for nuance, for ambiguity tolerance, for the deeper, messier work of psychological integration and engaging with the world in all its complexity.
Which ultimately might be essential for genuine maturity and resilience.
That's the argument, yes. Embracing complexity, while harder, arguably fosters greater, more sustainable growth.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. You asked for a thorough look, different perspectives, those aha moments. We really hope this exploration of Peterson's order-chaos cosmology has provided that for you.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Where in your own life might you find yourself drawn to these kinds of simplified frameworks, maybe for comfort or clarity? What could you potentially gain by stepping back and trying to embrace the inherent messiness, the ambiguity of those situations? And maybe ask yourself, are the dragons you face truly external enemies to be slain? Or could they be better understood as internal conflicts or complex systemic challenges that need a different kind of engagement? Something to think about.
A good question to end on.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.